to order. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for this Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on human rights in the Middle East and North Africa, 10 years after the Arab Spring. I extend a special welcome to the witnesses, and I thank them for their commitment to human rights and for sharing their expertise with us today. I see my co-chair, Congressman Chris Smith, is on the line. I think others may join us. And we'll acknowledge them when they do. It's been 10 years since a wave of popular pro-democracy, pro-human rights movements in mostly Muslim countries of the Middle East and North Africa inspired hope in the region and the world. In short, we witnessed the resignation of an authoritarian president in Tunisia, important constitutional reforms in Morocco, and the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. Change seemed on the horizon in Bahrain and in Syria. But 10 years later, many of the initial successes have been rolled back. Most of the popular movements have been brutally repressed by authoritarian rulers who, instead of being replaced by democratic leaders, have consolidated their grip on power. Syria, Yemen, and Libya have been ravaged by armed conflicts with devastating humanitarian consequences for the region and the world. As we will hear today, authoritarian governments across the region have used similar methods to suppress dissent, many of which are simply and unequivocally human rights violations. These methods have included criminalization of speech and association, prolonged arbitrary detention, torture, stripping of nationality, reprisals against family members, and intrusive regulation of non-governmental organizations. Often, the governments justify these measures by claiming they are combating terrorism. Even when the United States has imposed sanctions on some of the individuals believed to be responsible for some of the gravest abuses, we have not seen the governments improve their behavior in significant ways. Under President Trump, the U.S. mostly looked the other way. That serious human rights violations are occurring in so many countries in a single region would be a concern to this commission under any circumstances. And in fact, we have held a number of briefings and hearings on the human rights situations in Bahrain, Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen in recent years. But our general concern is magnified because several of the countries with the worst human rights records are long-standing allies of the United States. These are countries that host U.S. military bases and to which the U.S. government regularly provides billions of dollars of security assistance and sells billions of dollars worth of arms. These are countries we describe as partners in the war against terrorism. Yet their own domestic policies appear to reproduce the conditions of disempowerment, exclusion, and hopelessness that feed radicalization. When states criminalize dissent, imprison writers and intellectuals, prevent opposition forces from organizing and competing, and limit freedom of the press, these are sure signs that those who hold power are afraid that they might lose. When anyone who thinks differently is at risk of being labeled a terrorist, this is not a sign of stability. When these kinds of measures overlap with discrimination based on religious or ethnic differences, states risk hardening social divisions and laying the groundwork for atrocities. Why does the United States tolerate these consistent patterns of human rights abuses by our supposed allies? Historically, energy independence had a lot to do with it. More recently, the excuse is that Iran is a bigger boogeyman than and we must make common cause to contain that authoritarian regime. Personally, I don't like being in the position where I'm expected to choose between bad authoritarian regimes. When I look at the Middle East, I also see many brave young people who have risked their lives to imagine a different world for themselves. People like Raif Badawi and his sister Samar, who are wasting away in prison because of the intolerance and fear of the ruling family in Saudi Arabia. I see the women who took leadership roles in the Arab Spring, the women who fought for the right to drive in Saudi Arabia in the 21st century, mind you, and ended up in jail for their efforts. I believe these are people U.S. foreign policy should be empowering in the Middle East. Many of my colleagues in Congress share this view, and that is reflected in recent initiatives to end the war in Yemen, condition or cut off arms sales to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and to require the Department of Defense to identify alternatives to basing the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, just to name a few. The bottom line is that we do not want the U.S. to be complicit in any way, shape, or form with human rights violations committed by allied governments. We've seen enough. We need a human rights-based U.S. foreign policy toward the region. And we are here today to receive recommendations on how to fundamentally rethink the U.S. relationship with countries of this region. I want to close by reading into the record the names of all the prisoners of conscience from the Middle East who are currently included in the Human Rights Commission's Defending Freedoms Project. I renew the call that each of them be released immediately and unconditionally. From Bahrain, Abdulhadi Al-Khawaja, a human rights defender. Abdul Jalil Al-Singasse, who's an engineer and a blogger. Ahmed Humadan, who's a photographer. Sheikh Ali Salman, leader of a banned political association. Nagi Fatil, a blogger, tweeter, and youth leader from Egypt. Mahmoud Abu Sharkan, a photographer, released but has had to spend every night in prison. From Iran, Youssef Nardakanani, converted to Christianity. Ardeshir Fanaan, a Baha'i. From Kuwait, Hamad al-Naki, a Shia Muslim who criticized Prophet Muhammad. From Saudi Arabia, Raif Badawi, blogger. Walid Abu al-Kahir, a human rights lawyer. Samar Badawi, a human rights activist who challenged the male guardianship program. From Syria, Khalil Matuk, head of the Syrian Center for the Defense of Detainees. From the United Arab Emirates, Ahmad Mansour, a human rights defender. This list does not begin to exhaust those who have been unjustly imprisoned, and I regret to say that there are thousands more. Just this week, we received requests for help with more cases. Jailed Bahrain opposition leader Hassan Mushaima, who's 72 years old, serving a life sentence for his part in the Pearl Uprising in 2011, and in poor health. Ola al-Karadawi and Hosan Khalaf, who have been arbitrarily detained in Egypt for 4 years without a trial, and the mother of Abdel Rahman El Shwek, a civilian convicted and imprisoned by a military court, was so severely tortured in Egypt's MENA prison that he had to be hospitalized. After she spoke to the media about her son, her home was raided. She, her husband, and her 18-year-old daughter were later arrested, and she was charged with belonging to a terrorist organization. Again, enough is enough. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Co-Chair Smith for any opening remarks he may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is one that is important, but also one that is fraught with pitfalls and requires a bit of humility about the limits of America's ability to impact outcomes. Namely, we must keep in mind that the human rights situation in the Middle East and North Africa is bad. It is very bad, but it can always get worse. The promise of the Arab Spring, unfortunately, was one which soon gave rise, in the phrasing of one astute commentator, to an Arab fall. Why this happened ultimately, I think, is because people in the countries such as Egypt determined that as bad as authoritarian rule was and is, when the alternative is governance in the name of political Islam, but be it the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the charnel house, which became Raqqa in Syria under ISIS, or the short-circuited prototypical rise of the Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria in the early 1990s, the supposed cure can often be worse than the disease. This then is the dilemma which we face today. We must do more to fight for human rights. I have spent my 41 years writing laws, including our trafficking laws, working on religious freedom. I was on a call with Frank Wolf yesterday, who authored the International Religious Freedom Act, which puts countries like Saudi Arabia on the CPC list, as it should. And we need to push for civil and political rights, which give rise to authentic democracy, which oppressive political systems, while having a realist understanding that a blundering commitment to quote unquote principles in the abstract can actually make matters worse. Witness what happened during the Bush administration, when all of the talk about we needed to have an election, and in came Hamas with their very, very commitment to terrorism and to death and destruction. And, we spent money in that election. So the principle was good. Yeah, we want elections, free and fair, absolutely. But what was the possible outcome there? And it was a terrorist organization. Further, populist revulsion that oppression, corruption, and incompetence governance can lead to a post-election hangover, where an incoming regime imposes Islamicism or political Islam, which replaces authoritarianism with a totalitarianism that creates even more of a human rights challenge. In other words, our actions should be guided, at least in part, by the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. It seems to me that part of the problem, and here I would really like to engage our panelists and the organizations they represent, is outside advocacy on behalf of some favored causes while ignoring others, and double standards which focus on some countries engaged in the MENA region while ignoring others whose conduct, I should say, is equally egregious. Thus, some call out abuses in Saudi Arabia, as do I, and we should. Yet we ignore or not as strongly speak out against what's going on in Iran or in Turkey, and the destabilizing role both those countries play in the region. More to the point, there is often an amplification of the flaws of Israel, the only true democracy in the region, and one which has an exemplary commitment to the rule of law and independent judiciary, while ignoring or downplaying far more egregious human rights abuses that occur in Gaza or the West Bank. There also should be greater advocacy on behalf of religious freedom and the rights of religious minorities throughout the region. The extinguishing of communities in the Middle East whose roots go back millennia and have lived alongside the majority for centuries, often in the oppressed status of dhimmitude, should be the first and foremost concern of every human rights organization. The very existence of religious minorities help create fertile ground for the growth of pluralism, mutual understanding, and tolerance in general. Their suppression is the harbinger of a greater suppression of the rights of all. I ask our panelists to examine critically the nature of the cases they highlight in their advocacy and the resources they devote to such advocacy. I would like to introduce a statement into the record by Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour, a participant in Egypt's Arab Spring, who had been arrested and tortured during the time of President Mubarak. And this, let me say, parenthetic with President Mubarak. I visited him in Egypt in the 1990s and pressed human rights issues, especially towards the Coptic Christians. Every year, he would make a trip here in the United States and meet with a bipartisan group of members. And there we did, in a bipartisan way, raise human rights issues, including some of the anti-Semitism that was found in the media. Let me get back. If Mr. Mansour writes pointedly about his own experience, but also raises the case of Kinda al-Khatib, a 23-year-old Lebanese woman and a social media activist who tweets, criticize Hezbollah and urge peace with Israel. She received a 3-year sentence by the Lebanese Armed Forces Court after she was indicted on the charge of collaborating online with the Israelis and being an enthusiast for peace. In prison, she contracted COVID-19 and lost weight to a life-threatening level. Instead of championing the causes of incarcerated nonviolent peace builders such as Kinda al-Khatib, however, we see advocacy on behalf of Islamists such as Saudi cleric Salman al-Odeh, jailed since 2017. For those familiar with al-Odeh, in 2004, he called for jihad against the United States-led coalition forces in Iraq. And in August 2012, Mr. al-Odeh said in an interview that the Holocaust, quote, has been turned into a myth of tremendous proportions, close quote. He then elaborated that, quote, through this Holocaust, the Jews began to extort many governments worldwide, in Europe and in the United States, and that the role of the Jews is to wreak havoc, destruction, to wage war, and to practice deception and extortion, close quote. And then to top it off, he engaged in blood libel, accusing the Jews of using blood to bake Passover matzahs. So my question is, why is the case of al-Odeh prioritized over that of al-Khatib? And why are institutional resources devoted to advocating for his release and not hers? To conclude, the human rights problems of the Middle East and North Africa are complex and confounding. I look forward to all of your testimonies. Thank you for being here at this hearing, and yield back to my friend and colleague.
Thank you very much. And now let me introduce our panel of witnesses. Thank you for being here. We appreciate everybody's participation. Philippe Nassif, who is an advocacy director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International USA. Before coming to Amnesty, Mr. Nassif worked as the executive director at the In Defense of Christians in the Middle East and at the poverty fighting organization CARE USA with the Obama campaign, and for the mayor of Houston, Texas. He was named one of the Hill's top human rights advocates in 2019 and in 2020 due to his work on Yemen and arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Sarah Holwinski is the Washington director at Human Rights Watch. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she was the first senior advisor on human rights in the chairman's office at the Joint Staff of the U.S. Department of Defense, and earlier served as deputy chief of staff for policy at the U.S. mission to the United Nations under Ambassador Samantha Power. For nearly a decade, she was the executive director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict, leading efforts to advise warring parties on civilian protection and responsible use of force. Excuse me. Samuel Tadros is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute's Center for Religious Freedom, researching Middle Eastern politics, Islamic movements, and religious freedom. He is also the co-host of Sam and Amar at Al Hora TV, a program dedicated to covering Middle Eastern political and social development from a classical liberal perspective. He was previously a distinguished visiting fellow in Middle Eastern Studies at the Hoover Institution and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Sarah Lee Whitson is the executive director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN. Previously, she served as executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division from 2004 to 2020, overseeing work in 19 countries. She had led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the region, has published widely on human rights and foreign policy in the Middle East and in international and religious and regional media. Stephen Mcinerney is the executive director of a project on Middle East democracy, POMED. Before joining this organization, he spent 6 years living, working, and studying in the Middle East and North Africa, 2 years each in Egypt, Lebanon, and Qatar. He has spoken on Middle East affairs with numerous media outlets and is published on Middle East affairs and U.S. policy. And again, I hope I didn't mess up everybody's name, but in any event, we're happy you're all here. We admire your commitment to human rights. Mr. Nassif, we will begin with you.
Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, and members of the Commission. On behalf of Amnesty International USA, I thank the Commission for the opportunity to submit this testimony. Over the past 10 years, since the mass uprisings of 2011 that became known as the Arab Spring, activists and human rights defenders across the Middle East and North Africa have continued to demand their rights in the face of relentless repression and vicious crackdowns. Governments across the MENA region displayed a chilling determination to crush protests with ruthless force and trample over the rights of hundreds of thousands of demonstrators who took to the streets to call for social justice and political reforms. Instead of addressing the root causes that drove people to take to the streets, authorities in Bahrain, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Yemen have crushed protests and attempted to silence dissent using extreme violence, mass arrests, and arbitrary detention to intimidate critics. 10 years on, the human rights situation across much of the Middle East and North Africa paints a bleak picture. Syria and Yemen are suffering the devastating human costs of armed conflict. Libya is a shattered state after a decade of tumult. The governments of Egypt and Bahrain have intensified their crackdowns on freedom of expression and human rights defenders. Yet despite all of this, there are clear signs that brave young people have not given up on demanding their rights. For example, in the fall of 2019, a new wave of mass protests swept the region. Algerians, Lebanese, Libyans, and Iraqis took to the streets demanding their government step down due to corruption and negligence. Egyptians, living years under the dark authoritarian clouds cast by President Sisi, took to the streets. Iran also saw tens of thousands of its own protests at great risk for their safety. Diplomats and policymakers around the world started asking themselves, will this unrest ever end? The quick answer is no. Because when over 600 young Iraqi men and women are killed by live ammunition, or when Lebanese protesters, Muslims and Christian, Shia, Sunni, and Druze continue to protest in the face of government crackdown, even when the world's largest non-nuclear explosion devastates swaths of their beloved capital city, Beirut, the people continue to pour out into the streets, fearful of nothing and hopeful for everything. A region more known for resignation and acceptance has now found its voice, which is one of collective action and people power, whatever the risk. The momentum that was building with the second wave of protests in 2019 came to a grinding halt, not from the clouds of tear gas and hail of bullets, but from COVID-19. Mass demonstrations were replaced by lockdowns, and hospital wards treating protesters were instead filled with feverish people struggling to breathe. This in turn has sparked even more unrest. Health systems, devastated in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, buckled under the triumvirate rule of corruption, war, and a pandemic. The disease has seeped from deep into Assad's notorious dungeons to the halls of power in Tehran and Riyadh. The mass uprisings of 2011 and then again in 2019 sent shockwaves across the region. The demonstrations broke the taboo surrounding popular protests and triggered an irreversible shift in the political imagination of young women and men. People in the region recognized the true power of peaceful protest and learned to dream of a different future for themselves, one where they seize control of their rights. Here's what the US Congress can do to support human rights and help stabilize the region. For Libya, pass the bipartisan Libya Stabilization Act in the House and Senate to ensure there is accountability for human rights violations and war crimes that occurred during the conflict. For Egypt, the US government should ban all arms sales to Egypt, along with the transfer of tear gas, small arms, ammunition, and other repressive equipment, and condition security aid to the country, broadly due to the egregious human rights violations committed by the Sisi government. The US government should also demand the Egyptian government release all prisoners of conscience, end attacks against peaceful protesters and independent media outlets, and ensure courts follow international standards for fair trials. For the crisis in Yemen, Congress should block the multi-billion-dollar arms sales to the UAE due to their conduct in Yemen and Libya, and their practice of handing off weaponry to militias who have gone on to commit human rights abuses, as documented in Amnesty's groundbreaking report, When Arms Go Astray. For Lebanon, the US government should approach Lebanon's current humanitarian crisis caused by a collapsed economy, the Beirut port blast, and COVID-19 as it treats a country following a natural disaster. Immediate humanitarian assistance in the form of food, water, medicine, electricity is needed to be delivered directly to the Lebanese people. And on Syria, the US Congress should pressure the executive branch to work with existing efforts led by the UN and European countries and the ICC to hold those in the Syrian government accountable for crimes against humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your excellent testimony, Ms. Holowinski.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you to you and to Congressman Smith for having us here. We very much appreciate the Lantos Commission and certainly having the hearing on this important topic. Let me say that Human Rights Watch is a global organization that helps to protect the rights of people in more than 90 countries by gathering facts and providing policymakers like you, information that you can use to hopefully create a foreign policy that has human rights as a central pillar. Let me get right to it. You have already said that the situation in the Middle East is bleak when it comes to human rights 10 years after the Arab Spring, and we couldn't agree more at Human Rights Watch. The conflicts, the autocrats, the imprisonment of political dissidents, and to echo what Philippe said, the apparent failure of the Arab Spring to bring in an era of respect for human rights hasn't stopped people throughout the region from agitating for their rights. And we've seen that in Algeria. We've seen similar movements in Iraq, in Lebanon. So the Arab Spring being a failure, as some people call it, does not mean that people gave up on championing human rights or fighting for human rights. And the human rights movements that struggle right now are not struggling only because of the coronavirus, but because of repressive national laws and the brutal tactics of security forces across the region. Already in this hearing, we've mentioned those tactics being used in Bahrain, in Egypt, in Iran, in Lebanon, in Syria. They are all of a piece. And even in Morocco and Jordan, which enjoy a relatively positive reputation with US foreign policy circles, they have cracked down hard on critics themselves, imprisoning peaceful protest leaders, as well as social media commentators, artists, and journalists. The Moroccan courts, in fact, have levied sentences as long as 20 years for peaceful activism. Which brings me to the recommendations that we can make for what the US can do. Because those countries, Morocco, Jordan, and several others, are allies of the United States and nevertheless are infringing on human rights. So put simply, the US government should reassess the policy mistakes that it have made in the past that have exacerbated human rights abuses in the MENA region, and it shouldn't repeat them. And that is stating the obvious, but it is apparently not so obvious when it comes to US foreign policy because it continues to make mistakes. The Trump administration further emboldened autocrats like the Egyptian president, like the Saudi crown prince. And even before President Trump and prior administrations, the United States sold and transferred billions in arms to governments that were not rights respecting and that repressed peaceful dissent and civil society. So I will make 4 recommendations on behalf of Human Rights Watch. And the first is to adopt a more consistent regional human rights approach to the Middle East and North Africa. And by consistent, we mean that the US public messaging and criticism of human rights abuses in the region have to stand for both the obvious rights abusing nations and perhaps those that are not so obvious. And that will be fundamental to addressing the credibility gap that has been created over decades. And the United States has tools that it can use to do this. So the Leahy laws and the Global Magnitsky Act are just 2, but they should be implemented across the board with allies and adversaries alike. Second, there should be a moratorium on arms sales and transfers to the worst rights abusing governments. It's already been noted in this hearing that arms sales notifications have been made for Egypt, for the United Arab Emirates. So as much as the administration, we have seen positive indications that it does want to make human rights a central pillar of its foreign policy, those 2 notifications to Congress have certainly given us pause. And if the Biden administration won't place a moratorium on those kinds of arms sales to rights disrespecting nations, we hope that Congress will do its part to make sure that weapons are not falling into the hands of repressive governments. Third, use peace deals and political agreements to strengthen and not undermine rights obligations. So clearly this comes to the forefront of the mind when we're thinking about the new JCPOA agreement, re-engaging with Iran on the nuclear deal. But there are other agreements and negotiations that are sure to come. Human rights should be part of those agreements and not be used as a justification to neglect or deprioritize human rights issues throughout the region. And fourth and finally, US support to civil society groups across MENA is critical. Human rights defenders are working every day at great risk to themselves and their families to document and push back against human rights abuses. They need US support. It could be public. So just as Congressman McGovern, you did today in reading out those names of political prisoners, that kind of public statement is remarkably important and shows human rights defenders that the United States is paying attention. But it can also be less direct. So the US can start by calling out government officials and others who threaten, persecute, or harm human rights defenders. They can, excuse me, especially call out governments who are threatening human rights defenders that have even left their own country, which is happening more and more often. So thank you again for allowing me to testify today, and I look forward to questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tadros.
Co-chairs McGovern and Smith, thank you for inviting me to testify at today's hearing. Instead of ushering in a new era of democratic transitions and greater freedoms, the Arab Spring, with few exceptions in Tunisia and Sudan, has not only resulted in maintaining the status quo of regime oppressions, but even led to the worsening of human rights conditions across the region. The limited political openings and growth of civil society organizations that many of the countries of the region had experienced prior to the Arab Spring has now been replaced with crackdowns on all forms of dissent and severe human rights violations. This deterioration has also taken place in non-Arab Spring countries, such as Turkey, where democratic institutions have crumbled under the assault of Erdogan's authoritarianism. Overall, the Middle East remains one of the least democratic regions across the world, with freedoms of religion and speech nearly completely absent. Yesterday, President Biden declared that America won't back away from its commitment to human rights and fundamental freedoms. If the US is to pursue a foreign policy that is rooted in its values and that seeks to improve human rights conditions in the Middle East and open the doors for democratic reforms, it must grapple with the legacy of the Arab Spring and the cracks that the past decade has exposed. Let me offer 4 such areas. First, the Arab Spring has exposed the inherent weakness of the modern Middle Eastern state. While the seeds of this collapse were sown from the start with borders drawn without the consent of the governed, ignoring the diverse population's own aspirations, the current collapse was neither predestined nor inevitable, but rather the outcome of regimes' failure to develop a governing compact that makes their citizens believe that the state was theirs and serving their interests. Secondly, today, regimes and large segments of their populations have developed a narrative to explain the ongoing turmoil that is rooted in a sinister plot led by the United States against the region, and which utilizes civil society and the media to bring harm to its countries. While this conspiracy theory serves regimes by deflecting blame, it is one that they themselves have come to believe and which US competitors such as Russia and Iran have helped create and amplify through their Arabic language propaganda outlets. Third, despite hopes that the Arab Spring would lead to the emergence of liberal and democratic actors in the region and finally put an end to the Faustian choice between authoritarian regimes and totalitarian Islamist movements, the past decade has only exposed the inherent weakness of liberal democratic actors across the region, as well as the flimsiness of their commitment to those values. Fourth, large segment of the region's populations viewed the events of the Arab Spring as a battle for survival. The rise of Islamist movements, whether to power or to take command of the anti-regime uprisings, has led many segments of the populations to choose the existing regimes despite their oppression as the lesser of two evils. The threat that Islamists pose to the nation-state framework, minority rights, and women's rights has meant that elections were viewed not as a repetitive process of selecting one's leaders every few years, but as a one-time event that would enshrine the Islamist's dominance and the demise of everyone else. Despite this legacy and the obstacle it poses to an attempt by the United States to promote greater freedoms and human rights in the Middle East, there is still room for the US to act in several key areas. First, the US should pay special attention to freedom of the press and access to information, which are denied to the region's peoples, by defending the few courageous voices and independent media outlets that still exist, as well as utilizing the available tools in its own arsenal to remedy this lack of access to accurate news, as well as counter conspiracy theories and anti-American rhetoric by those regimes, especially those that are allies of the United States. Secondly, while US support for specific parties or politicians would not be helpful, a commitment to supporting democratic institutions and ideas is necessary, especially through the educational systems, which would help remedy this weakness on the long run. Thirdly, religious minorities across the region are under assault by both regimes and Islamist groups. Helping foster safeguards for religious minorities not only helps their prospects of survival, but can genuinely ease the societal tensions in those countries by fostering toleration and bonds of trust among the region's populations. Thank you again for holding this hearing, and I look forward for your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Whitson.
Thank you to the Lantos Commission for organizing this hearing on U.S. policy in the Middle East and North Africa. My colleagues whom we've heard from have already spoken and will be speaking some more about the conditions for human rights abuses across the region, which I think can fairly be described as catastrophic, as war and conflict continue to engulf the region with internationalized armed conflict, civil wars, mass repression, systematic and widespread torture, impunity of security forces, grossly politicized judiciaries, and the wholesale deprivation of civil and political rights affecting most people in the region. Our responsibility in the United States as policymakers, human rights advocates, lawmakers in this Congress, and ordinary citizens is to closely and critically examine our government's policies in the region and to assess whether we are making things better or worse for those most directly impacted by our policies in the region. Our first order of priority in response to Congressman Smith is to insist that our government complies with its own human rights obligations that prohibit contributing to abuses. We also have a responsibility to ensure the enforcement of existing American laws that prohibit us from transferring weapons to systematically abusive governments. That's our priority. That is where our attention should be turned. And I'm sorry to say that US policy has failed to achieve these aims. Over the past decade of the Arab uprisings, since the Arab uprisings, and many decades prior to that, the United States has actively aided and abetted the most serious abuses in the Middle East by providing military, economic, and diplomatic support to authoritarian, repressive, and apartheid governments in the region, in breach of our own human rights obligations under US and international law. We need only look at the practices of America's largest beneficiaries in the region. And yes, that is where our attention should rightly be focused, because that is where we have the greatest responsibility. So the names that Congressman McGovern just read of political prisoners in the Middle East, that's also on us. This is not just about what those rulers are doing over there. This week, Human Rights Watch, thank you, Sarah, for that, issued a detailed report finding that the Israeli government is responsible for the crimes of apartheid and persecution in its governance of Palestinians, pursuant to a governmental policy to maintain the domination of Israeli Jews over Palestinians, both inside Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territory. Its findings follow the same conclusion made by leading Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations, which have long come face to face with the ugly reality of the Israeli authorities' systemic and severe discrimination against Palestinians. Palestinian efforts, very much a part of the Arab uprisings, to protest their 50-plus years of inhumane occupation, to seek judicial accountability at the International Criminal Court, to demand equal rights under the government that controls them, and to use peaceful means like advocating for boycott and sanctions of Israel, have been met with punitive measures imposed by the US government and US states. These measures punishing Palestinian resistance include withdrawing funding in response to appeals to the International Criminal Court, silencing of peaceful advocacy through so-called anti-BDS laws, and most recently, reassurances from the majority of this Congress and the Biden administration that US military support, whatever Israel's abuses, will remain unconditional. The unparalleled military support and diplomatic protection we provide to the Israeli government contributes to the abuses committed against Palestinians, which we should now collectively label as apartheid. I want to say a note on the Palestinian elections, as well as the Egyptian elections that Congressman Smith alluded to earlier. I want to emphasize that we as Americans don't get to choose who the Arab people or the people of any country elect as their leaders. Indeed, humility is in order. This week as well, notwithstanding the holy month of Ramadan, another of America's security partners, Egypt, executed 17 detainees in a single day in what we know to be the mold of grossly unfair trials and procedures that have resulted in the jailing of over 50,000 political activists since the 2013 military coup deposed Egypt's democratically elected president. Egypt has become a world leader in executions, carrying out 228 executions since 2014. By last count, 106 former members of Egypt's parliament remain unjustly imprisoned, possibly the highest number of parliamentarians jailed anywhere in the world. When Hoda Abdelhamid, whom Congressman McGovern referred to, the mother of political detainee Abdelrahman al-Shweikh, released a video detailing the sexual assault and torture to which Egyptian security forces had subjected her son, security forces arrived in the middle of the night to arrest her, her husband, and their 18-year-old daughter. Egyptian General Prosecutor Hamada al-Sawi, who was welcomed in the United States as part of a judicial delegation celebrating US-Egypt cooperation, has made no investigation into al-Shweikh's credible claims of torture. Retaliatory arrests of family members are the norm to punish activists abroad and at home. Egypt has detained Ola al-Qaradawi and her husband Hussam Khalaf for nearly 4 years, almost entirely in solitary confinement, effectively holding them as hostages in their pursuit of Ola's father, Islamist scholar Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's currently in exile. In Egypt today, complaining about the rape, torture, or disappearance of your children, acting as a lawyer to defend the persecuted, writing as a journalist, even making music, acting, taking photographs, or putting out a juvenile TikTok video will find you subject to prosecution as a terrorist. Why is this our problem? It's our problem because we must be clear that providing $1.3 billion in annual military assistance to this government of Egypt supports its crimes against the Egyptian people. The outdated security interests offered to justify our continued support of this repressive government fail to withstand serious scrutiny. Congress has, as usual, conditioned $300 million of our annual aid on certain human rights reforms, including an unprecedented $75 million not subject to the usual so-called national security waiver, conditioned on the release of political prisoners. We also should acknowledge, however, that conditioning this small portion of US military aid, as welcome as that would be, is insufficient to bring any significant reforms in the country. Instead, the US government should end entirely US military and financial support for Egypt's government. The reality is that providing military support to Egypt's government violates our own human rights obligations and laws prohibiting weapons transfers to systematically abusive governments. For similar reasons, the US should end its military support of the Israeli authorities, including the Israeli military authorities maintaining a 54-year occupation, not a democracy, of Gaza and the West Bank. The Biden administration has heard this message loudly with respect to arms sales to Saudi Arabia. America's participation in the devastating and needless war in Yemen over the past 5 years is another shameful blight on our deadly record in the region. It is important that Biden has ended our active collaboration in the Saudi and Emirati indiscriminate and deliberate attacks on Yemeni civilians. But we must be clear that the continued provision of so-called defensive weapons to Saudi Arabia, which strikes a semantic jargon to many, as well as the approval just recently of $23 billion in arms to the UAE, serve only to embolden and assist their undemocratic, unelected, unaccountable, and brutal leaders, not their subject populations, in their malign regional interventions that cause chaos and instability. Just this week, reports documented how Chad rebels, who served as mercenaries in Libya for Haftar's militia, relied on weapons supplied by the United Arab Emirates to launch a coup in Chad. I think you're right, Congressman Smith. The US has no capacity or credibility to fix all that is wrong in the Arab world. That is and should be beyond the remit of any foreign actor. The US does, however, have an absolute legal, ethical, and national interest and obligation to end its support for systematically abusive governments in the region. This is where we must draw a real red line. Let me not leave out, only because of the pleas of so many who have reached out to me in anticipation of this hearing, to call out Jordan, another unelected monarchy, whose stability apparently hangs by a thread. We are concerned by the detention of Prince Hamza outside of any judicial process, and King Abdullah calling this a house arrest and a family matter doesn't make it legal. Even princes in the Middle East apparently need human rights protections. They are certainly entitled to them as human beings, first and foremost. Thank you again to the Commission for having me today, and a special thank you to Commission staff members Piero Tozzi and Kim Stanton for all their hard work in organizing this hearing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mcinerney.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the Lantos Commission and co-chairs Congressman McGovern and Congressman Smith for your crucial work to support human rights abroad. Thank you as well for convening this hearing on human rights and U.S. policy in the Middle East and North Africa, and for giving me this opportunity to address you all. I fully agree with the comments of the other panelists regarding the awful and worsening situation for human rights across the MENA region and for the appalling abuses of most of the authoritarian dictatorships in place across the region. I will focus my remarks primarily on the role of U.S. policy. And I'd like to begin by just speaking frankly about how I see the policies of the United States toward the Middle East and North Africa. I consider them to be a catastrophe, a strategic failure, and a moral stain on our country. If the goals of the United States in this region were to facilitate human rights abuses, including the imprisonment, torture, and murder of innocent civilians, to prevent democratization and to fuel radicalization, instability, and violence, then I would say that longstanding American policies in place would be approximately the right ones. And I would say that those policies have been successful toward these unconscionable goals. Given, however, that the officially stated goals of the United States are precisely the opposite of what I just described, the entirety of the United States policy should be viewed as a spectacular failure. But one of the most striking things about US policy toward the Middle East is that no matter what happens, no matter how badly policies fail, the answer here in Washington always seems to be to double down on those policies rather than ever changing course. Back in the 1990s, US policy toward the MENA region was already dominated by the provision of weapons and other support to repressive authoritarian regimes. Following the horrific attacks of September 11th, 2001, The two main US responses in the region were first, the invasion of Iraq, an enormous strategic error with devastating consequences. Second, a dramatic increase in the delivery of arms to authoritarian regimes. A decade later, in 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings ousted 4 dictators from power within 13 months, demonstrating the folly of relying on dictatorships to provide stability, and also demonstrating the overwhelming desire of the citizens of the region for the rights and freedoms enjoyed by others around the world. These remarkable events of the Arab Spring should have been viewed by the United States as a historic opportunity to overhaul its failed policies, but instead the opposite happened. The main response of the Obama administration was to double down on these policies by drastically increasing weapons sales to dictatorships. Then the Trump administration doubled down yet again, ramping up these sales to all new heights. The disturbing reality is that the Washington policy community seems to not actually care about stability in the Middle East, despite decades of rhetoric to the contrary. Most policymakers don't care at all about human rights either. Instead, I believe that the single most important driver of US policy is the corrupt influence of actors who benefit from the status quo and from existing policies, especially the repugnant dictatorships who are in fact themselves the main source of instability. The most dangerous development regarding US policy toward the MENA region is the escalation of the corrupt use of funds by some of the world's very worst dictators, who should be viewed as mass murderers and terrorists, to buy influence here in Washington through lobbying, consulting, and PR contracts, weapons purchases, funding for think tanks and universities, and calculated investments in our own private sector. It's simply not possible to support human rights and to support dictatorship. You have to choose. Supporting one of those means opposing the other, and our government, tragically, consistently supports dictatorship across the region rather than democracy, with disastrous yet predictable consequences. To improve US policy toward the MENA region, this must fundamentally change. Our country must support human rights and oppose the brutality of dictatorship. What would this mean in practice? So many changes, but for the moment, I'd like to highlight just 3 main suggestions. My first recommendation is to end US support for murderous dictators. Conveniently, numerous federal laws ban weapons sales or military aid to regimes guilty of egregious human rights abuses. That means that the dominant form of US engagement with the region is in fact illegal under our own laws that successive administrations have blatantly ignored. Congress, led by members of the Lantos Commission, should aggressively demand and enforce compliance by the executive branch with such laws. My second recommendation is that whenever there is progress toward democratization, supporting that progress should be a top priority. In the past decade, the only country in the region making real progress on democracy or human rights is Tunisia. Supporting Tunisian democracy should be the #1 priority for the United States in the region. Sadly, it has been more of an afterthought. My third recommendation is that Congress should actively fight against the pervasive corrupt influence of dictatorships here in Washington. This includes all of the authoritarian regimes of the region. Some of the worst offenders of engaging in such corruption include the regimes of the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco. Members of this commission should firmly oppose the inclusion of witnesses during any congressional hearings from any organization funded by authoritarian regimes. In addition, Congress should pass legislation barring anyone who has served in either the executive or legislative branch from working for such organizations. And anyone who has been on the payroll of dictatorships should be barred from service in our own government. Thank you. I will leave my remarks there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's testimony. Let me just say to my co-chair, I have several questions, and so I'm giving you the opportunity if you want to go before me to proceed. If you would prefer to do that, that would be fine with me.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for that courtesy. Let me just, Ms. Whitson, if I could, just so I know where you're coming from, do you believe in Israel's right to exist in secure borders?
Congressman Smith, there is no such thing as a right to exist for a state under international laws. So do I believe that there is a state called Israel? There is a state called Israel, and I would very much like to see it declare its borders, which it has refused to do persistently.
So do you believe they have a right to
I think-
exist? Do they have a right?
There is no such
Answer the
thing as
question.
okay, there's no such thing as a right to exist under international law.
country-
The United States does not have a right to exist under international law. It's not, there's no, this is some kind of a.
Are you
no
glad that
treat-
they're a country?
Am I glad that they're a
Are
country?
you glad?
I'm
I mean,
glad that they're a
the right to
country.
exist has been,
Sure.
as you know, has been the issue with the PLO, the PLA, as well as with the issue going way back to Yasser Arafat. So do you want them to continue existing?
I support any and every state in the world, including, I support Israel to be a state that abides by its human rights obligations, international obligations. I fully support any state, including the state of Israel, that aspires and commits to respecting the human rights of all of the people under its control. I don't have love or affection for any state other than my country, the United States of America. I'm very glad to be an American, but it's not my responsibility to be glad or loving. Or loving about other states or countries around the world. I mean, I'm glad.
Let me ask you about something that is done routinely by the PLA. They provide payments to suicide bombers, those who and their families. We passed legislation, as my co-chair knows so well, called the Taylor Force Act, to limit aid based on the egregious nature of that. It's like the mafia being the hitman, saying, go and kill, commit terrorist acts, and you will not only, if you survive and you go into an Israeli jail, when you are let out, we'll have a place for you in the government, but we will also pay your family. Do you believe that's the right thing to do? Are you in favor of that policy?
I don't believe that there's any positive policy of paying terrorists to kill.
Does it exist?
People. I think there has been an explanation from the Palestinian authorities about the payments as Social Security payments to families where anybody in their family has died. I don't know, and you can correct me as a matter of fact if I'm wrong, that there are special unique payments to families of people who've been accused of terrorist acts.
Well, I'm shocked that you don't know that is a policy. And so much so that, again, in a bipartisan way, Democrats and Republicans went to the hip. We passed the Taylor Force Act to try to say our money will be contingent to the PLA based on whether or not they end that practice. And we actually have diminished the amount of money that we have provided based on that. And you're saying you don't know if it's a policy? Of course it's a policy.
No.
Are you for
I
it?
understand the law. I understand the U.S. policy and the U.S. law. And it is something that in my past job at Human Rights Watch, we raised and inquired about. The answer we received was that these are Social Security payments given to all family members who've lost a family member. If there is a specific and unique policy tailored to paying the families or people accused of terrorism directly and specifically, I don't know about it, but I would welcome being educated about it. And I am aware
It is policy, since it is a policy. So let's just say, hypothetically, since you don't know that it's a policy, would you be against such a policy?
Yes, I would be absolutely against any policy that rewards people who carry out terror attacks by payments from state funds or private funds or any kind of funds. I think that would be very bad.
Okay, let me ask you, you mentioned, and I mentioned Mr. Aladez, on his website, he has called for a jihad against the United States. He has advocated for the murder of Americans, men and women in uniform. He is also, the problem of people who are translators who have worked with our government. He has obviously taken on them, that they're committing a crime. And then his anti-Semitism is absolute. I mean, he is so against he's a Holocaust denier. And if he believes at all that it was real, he thinks it's being exploited. I have led the effort for years on combating anti-Semitism, and one of the bedmarks, the most important parts of that, is Holocaust remembrance of what the Nazis did do to Jewish people during World War II. So my question is, why would he be your political prisoner that you raised? And another one I noticed, and that is a woman named Abdel Monem, I could be mispronouncing her name, who is with the Muslim Brotherhood. She wrote that a woman is obligated to follow her husband if he calls her to bed, and I have the source for this if you want it, and defended the husband's right to beat her if he doesn't comply. Let me ask you, Ms. Whitson, is wife beating, isn't it violence against women? And she's calling it a right. Do you agree with that?
Congressman Smith, let me explain a basic principle of human rights and free speech. Human rights activists.
You agree with that?
I will answer your question, but it seems like I need to establish some fundamentals. We defend the free speech of people in this country and abroad, regardless of the speech, whether we like it or we don't like it. The principle of free speech. Excuse me.
What about when there's incitement to violence?
Congressman, you actually, do you want me to answer the question? I don't know.
And I want you to include that. How about where there's incitement to violence?
Congressman, we do not believe that the death penalty that Salman al-Hodi is currently facing in Saudi Arabia is fair or just or based on any fair or just proceeding. He has literally been charged for tweets that called for reconciliation with Qatar, far from inciting violence. That is among the charges he faces the death penalty for. The other charge, if you would call it that he faces the death penalty for, Congressman, is expressing cynicism towards the rulers and mocking the rulers. Do you believe, Congressman Smith, that he should be executed for these offenses? That is the crux of the matter.
Whether it be Cardessa and the fact that the militants attacked and killed and tortured police in 2013. I'm not for the death penalty there. I'm not for the death penalty in the States. I'm not for the death penalty anywhere. But holding somebody for other things, including those who committed those atrocities against the police in Egypt, I think is a very legitimate thing.
You're right.
So
police
we agree
need to
on the
keep
death
us safe.
penalty, but again,
police need to keep us safe, and police need to catch criminals and put them away, and police need to put people who kill anybody, whether police or others, away. That's not what's happening in trials in Egypt. In one trial in Egypt, hundreds of people were sentenced to death in a mass trial that lasted minutes. There is no due process. There are tens of thousands of political prisoners in Egypt who's never even been tried. Never even been before a judge.
On your view towards, I get what you're saying. Let me get, with regards to your, you don't believe we should be providing military aid to Israel. Is that correct?
Yes.
None? Zero?
I do not believe that US law permits us to provide military assistance to systematically abusive governments. That's in the law, Congressman. You're welcome to read it. It's in the Foreign Military Assistance Act. Sadly, it's not an enforced provision of the law. Every human rights organization, including the US State Department, has for many, many years documented systematic, widespread abuses by the Israeli government. Pursuant to US law, that military assistance should be suspended if you believe only the words of the US State Department's annual human rights reports.
I read the human rights report. I read it every year. Let me ask Sam Tedros, if I could. With regards to, if you could elaborate, if you would, on this idea that we could go from bad to worse. We all know that we went from the Shah of Iran, and I certainly spoke out against the other abuses that were being committed by his secret police. But then we got Khomeini. We went from Baptista in Cuba to Fidel Castro and all of the political prisoners and torturing that took place in his gulags. What would be your recommendation on U.S. policy? I believe, and I wrote the law on combating human trafficking called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And of all things, Israel was cited as a tier 3 country. and they did everything they could to get off of it, as did South Korea, which was also cited as a tier 3 under the Bush administration, to make clear we have no tolerance for buying and selling women and labor trafficking or sex trafficking or any kind of trafficking. But if you could speak, Sam, Tedros, to the issue of next steps for us as a country. I do believe it has to be at our core. Yesterday, I was in a big conversation with Frank Wolf and a number of others, Tom Swaze, online about Nigeria. I did a hearing, as you know, Mr. Chairman, you were part of it, in December on the deteriorating situation under Buhari and the Fulani, who are massacring people. Boko Haram, which we know has been doing it for quite some time, killing, including Muslims, not just Christians. So what would be your recommendations to us as to where do we proceed here? Because we have to have human rights as the core, but we also got to make sure that we're providing assistance. I am, with all due respect to Ms. Whitson, a very strong supportive aid to Israel. I think human rights, just like if you have no police, good luck having security and human rights in even our towns. You do need a military capability for deterrence, and I think our aid helps to provide that to the Israelis. But Mr. Tedros, if you could speak to that.
Thank you, Congressman. I think the challenge, as I said in my testimony, is that there are no perfect actors that we can ally with or support in the region. There are authoritarian regimes whose oppressive policies and acts have been detailed in the hearing. There are totalitarian Islamist movements whose abuses of not only religious minorities, but anyone who disagrees with their vision has also been mentioned. And there's the inherent weakness that we have of truly democratic and liberal voices in many of these countries. It was a sad spectacular to see people who claim to be in favor of democracy and liberal values side with a military coup, for example, because they feared the Muslim Brotherhood more than the military in that regard. But that is the reality that we're dealing with. We can't create actors out of the ground. We can't support things that don't exist. We deal with the reality that's there. However, despite that reality and those obstacles, as I said in the testimony, I think there are some areas where we can really help and make a difference. We can't completely change Egypt. It's not going to become a democracy tomorrow. This is an unrealistic prospect, but we can actually change things and make things better for some of these issues and some of these conditions. We really need to address the anti-Americanism and conspiracy theories that are spread by the regime itself. I mentioned in my written testimony the fact that as we speak today, an Egyptian TV channel that is controlled by the Egyptian state is airing a TV series that depicts the Arab Spring events as a plot by the US, that the US supports terrorism, and this is presented as an actual fact. This should not be an acceptable conduct of an ally of the United States, not only because of the anti-Americanism, but because these conspiracy theories impact the Egyptian-American relationship and stop any possibility of building real bridges between the two countries. So there is something to be done there, and also to utilize the tools that the US has itself in its own arsenal, through the embassy, through its own media in Arabic, to counter those narratives, to offer actual, accurate information to the populations of these countries that are denied. Religious freedom is also another important area. We've seen abuses against religious minorities, whether it's Christians, Yazidis, Shias in Sunni majority states, Sunnis in Shia majority states. All of these countries, we've seen the fact that you're part of a religious minority means that you are discriminated against. And that issue is very important because, as was mentioned, those religious minorities have been there for, more than 2,000 years. They've also really contributed to this diversity and uniqueness that the Middle East has had, being a bridge between the East and the West. So I think there are several areas that we can work on. There are political prisoners in some of these countries that cannot be accused of any act of terrorism. The case of Rami Kamel, the Coptic activist who documents abuses in Egypt against the Copts. but he's still being held by the Egyptian regime. There are the former member of the Egyptian parliament, Ziad al-Alimi, Omar al-Shaniti, a businessman, people that really under no circumstances can be accused of being part of the Muslim Brotherhood or involved in anything regarding terrorism. And we should be talking about those cases and raising them with the Egyptian government.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairman. You're back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think we've been joined by Congresswoman Omar and Congresswoman Jackson Lee. So I'm trying to see him. So Congresswoman Omar, if you're present, I will yield to you. Okay, if I don't told she's on the line. I can't see her. Congressman Jackson Lee. All right, well, they may.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So I yield to you.
Congressman, right. So
Just a moment. Am I next? Sorry.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you to the witnesses. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I think you know what we are doing in this world of virtual.
We're doing multiple hearings at the same time. I know. All right.
And so, but I did not want to miss this very important hearing and to assess this issue. So let me just quickly go to the witnesses and start with Mr. Nassif. It is clear that there was a momentum building for a second wave of protests in 2019, with mass protests sweeping through Algeria, Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, Egypt, and Iran. However, this momentum came to a halt due to COVID-19 as health systems began to become overrun. So how have governments in the region altered their behavior towards protesters during the pandemic, if at all? And then what can we do in the United States to support human rights and stabilize the region? Before you answer the question, let me just make a few points about the overall excitement and the level of hope that we had with the Arab Spring. All of the countries I obviously had been to, Algeria in particular, the tragedy of the young student who burned himself, that just catapulted, tragically, almost like the George Floyd killing here. It just went across, and it sprung hope as well as desperation. And of course, in Egypt, when President Obama made that speech, really thought we were on a journey. And it looks like with the killing and the Washington Post journalist is sort of off to this side, but anyhow, without conviction, if you will, by Saudi Arabia. And then there's just a litany of single incidents and mass incidences. It looks like we've stepped back. The Arab world is very important. We're in the middle of Ramadan, coming to its end. Muslims are very important in the United States. And there's connections between the United States and that world. So I guess, where did we go wrong would be my concern. And if others want to, I'll call on my good friend from the Human Rights Watch as well. But where did we go wrong? And might I just throw in Jordan? Because I'm surprised to hear of suppression in Jordan, because we would always, the United States always felt comfortable in deporting people to Jordan. I don't like deporting people, but they'd always say, well, they can go to Jordan. So where did we go wrong, if you would? Thank you. I'm sorry, I asked Mr. Nassif. Did you hear me, Philippe?
Yes, I can hear you, Congressman. Thank you so much for.
Did you hear the question? I'm sorry, maybe my voice was. Did you hear the question?
Yes, I did. I heard all of it. Thank you very much for your question. And you highlighted a lot of the struggle for human rights across the region, and you asked a very important question of where did we go wrong, which I'd like to sort of tackle first. We went wrong by failing to really understand the needs of the people of the region. this is a part of the world that has been looking for greater human rights, freedom of the press, freedom to organize, freedom to move about, worship freely without fear of repression and arrest, as many of the other witnesses have brought up. And instead, the United States policy, largely for the past several decades, has been to support relatively autocratic governments that have actually continued to suppress these very human rights that the people of the region have been demanding for quite some time. And I think that your example of that catalyst of the young man who set himself alight in Tunisia that sparked the Arab Spring, and the numerous self-immolations that have occurred since across the region, was just a demonstration of that frustration reaching a boiling point. When you couple that with failing economies, endemic corruption, in a sense, a lack of a future for the many young people of the region, you saw these mass protests break out, and that fear, that seal of fear that kept people from organizing and from taking to the streets, it was gone. And it hasn't really come back to a certain extent, which is why we continue to see various bouts of unrest that continue to bubble up in various countries in the region, including in Iraq and in Lebanon today, and even in Iran. And so ultimately what the United States can do is completely overhaul the way it looks at the Middle East and North Africa. It needs to take away the security lens that it views the region, solely focused on anti-terrorism efforts, focused on keeping things quiet, so to speak, and instead elevate the concerns of the people when our elected officials are traveling to the region, when the executive branch is visiting the monarchies of Jordan, of Saudi Arabia, of other Gulf countries, as they will likely be doing the next several days, from my understanding. We have to make sure that human rights are elevated in the conversation, that the killing of Khashoggi was wrong, and he's not the first person to have been killed and ordered to have been killed by a Middle Eastern government. In fact, there have been thousands and thousands of people like him who have been targeted and assassinated and killed, and it's still continuing today.
Thank you. And let me ask Ms. Whitson let me ask Sarah Holwinski of Human Rights Watch, I believe is here.
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
That same question.
Yeah, terrific. It's a great question. I'm going to answer very simply to a very complicated question, which is what did the US do wrong? And I will just say simply that it has not been consistent. Human rights law, international law, sets a standard. It is a consistent standard, but the United States itself has not been consistent in adhering to that law, nor in requiring its allies to adhere to that law and those standards. And so what I would say going forward is that the United States cannot treat its allies and adversaries differently when it comes to human rights. And should always have human rights at the table when negotiating or dealing diplomatically with other countries. That does not mean that human rights will always rule the day over economic or other interests, but rather that human rights should be a primary consideration. And I think if it were, from administration to administration, you would see more consistency, you would see more trust, and you would certainly see more human rights norms built up over time.
Thank you. I want to make a comment, but I want to ask Ms. Whitson, because you've described conditions of human rights catastrophic and with internationalized armed conflicts. And my heart is pained about not only the Mideast, I know that's what we're focusing on, but the extent of Boko Haram in Africa, which are obviously two T's of the movement out of the Mideast and Northern Africa, and the warlike conflicts on the continent. Rather than seeing the 21st century calm, we're seeing a 21st century surge. But if you would talk about what leverage the United States possesses to improve human rights situation in the region. And I'd also like you to add, is the United Nations, can that be an honest broker or a complement to what we're trying to do? And I want to add to this point that you have just made, Ms. Howinski, and I hope I haven't abused your name. I apologize, and I don't know if Stephen is there as well, but I
It's
hope I haven't
perfect.
totally abused it. I don't know if I'm supposed to say Holowinski. Am I correct? Okay.
It can actually go either way, but yeah.
Okay. All right. You just gave me a initiative legislation. I've got to look at it, and that is regarding the idea of the administrations plural, having human rights at the table in these discussions. Because I've been overseas on Codels, and you're the skunk at the party if you're sitting down at the end of the table, and you want to congressional delegations, and you're internationally, and you raise your hand. I'd like to ask about the human rights record. And you're almost with a sense of humor, Mr. Chairman, co-chairman, you're eyeballed out the room because we're supposed to be talking trade, or we're supposed to be talking issues dealing with international relationships. But my concern is that we do have human rights on the table. I think we'd be better off for it. But Ms. Whitson, if you would give us your idea about the conflicts and where we are in the region.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership on human rights and so many other important fronts. I'm a huge fan of yours. I guess I would look at this issue a little bit differently and focusing on your question about leverage and American leverage for human rights reforms. My view is that the US, in fact, has very little leverage to demand or extract human rights reforms. And the notion that we would leverage military assistance to authoritarian, abusive, apartheid governments and somehow use that military assistance to cajole them to make human rights reforms is really nowhere supported in the facts or the evidence. And in fact, that notion of conditionality and leverage, the record is very clear that it basically never works. And I think we have to come to terms with the reality that these governments have no interest in reforming or changing because their existence, their authoritarianism, their unelected status depends on repressing their population. They would not be in power if they liberalized or democratized or allowed free speech or provided equal rights. And so we have to make sure that we are not supporting these governments because that runs counter to our own human rights responsibilities under US law and international law. We may not be able to fix the conflicts in the region. We don't have the credibility to fix the conflicts of the region. We have been the creator of conflicts in the region, like in Iraq. We've been active participants in the war in Yemen. I don't want the United States to decide how it's going to fix the Middle East. I want the United States to stop harming the Middle East by military support to abusive governments in the region. That's the best and most important thing we can do. We should rely on multilateral institutions like the United Nations to approach issues of human rights in a multilateral fashion and in a consistent fashion, as my colleague Sarah was referring to. But to selectively target and sanction and punish states like Iran and even Syria in ways that are disastrous for the populations of Iran and Syria, while we are participating in the devastation of the children of Yemen, literally providing the bombs that are raining down on schools and clinics and hospitals in Yemen, it doesn't make sense. It's not consistent, and so it fails. Really what we have to do is to normalize the very abnormal relationship the US has with the Middle East, with more troops, more military bases, more military assistance, more military sales than any other country in the world. That's quite abnormal. Let's have a normal economic relationship. Let's have a normal relationship where we have counterterrorism cooperation, where we buy access to VIP passage at the Suez Canal, or any of the reasons that are in our security interest. But let's not make it abnormal by providing military assistance to authoritarian, abusive apartheid states in the region.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for, may I squeeze just one point in? I'd
Yes.
like to do so in my conclusion. I think this has been an enormously well-rounded hearing and one that is both important and overdue, to be frank with you, because we have consistently pre-COVID traveled to the Mideast, and we have traveled to those who are allies, and we know what the discussions have been. I happen to want to save Jordan. I know Jordan from the perspective of being the largest, being the country with the largest number of individuals that are not Jordanians, that they have been a place for Palestinians and others. As I indicated, I am a real live witness to when Americans, when persons are deported who have no terrorist issues, they have immigration issues, they are promptly deported to Jordan. I had a Palestinian family who had done nothing but be Muslim during 9/11, and neighbors called and said they're terrorists. They're meeting in their house. They just happen to be a big family, 7 children. They were deported to Jordan. And so here we are with news representations of what is happening in Jordan. Someone who wants to take that question as to how do we help Jordan? How do we help the king? What is going to be Jordan's future on some of the issues that I've been hearing? Does anyone have?
Well, I'll chime in briefly. I'll chime in briefly and then cede to my colleague, Stephen, who I know has covered this much more closely. I think it's very important that we avoid confusing helping the king, who is not an elected democratic leader of this country, who is responsible for grave repression in the country, just most recently canceling the teachers' union, arresting teacher strikers, and rules by a much more repressive fist than we in the United States are aware of. In fact, currently he is holding his own brother under so-called house arrest without any judicial process, without ever having brought him to court on any charges, just because he's the king and he can do it. So I think we need to reevaluate our military support to the monarchy in Jordan and really critically examine whether this is military support that is helping the Jordanian people. I think there are much, much better ways to help the Jordanian people. And I commend you for recognizing that the Jordanian government has played a vital role in providing security for Syrian refugees, over 1 million, as well as Palestinian refugees for many decades.
Well, you opened it up, Ms. Whitson, in the way that I wanted it to be responded to, because obviously when I said the king, I was hoping, or I was suggesting, can we help him undo what it looks like he is now moving more extensively toward? And obviously, as you well know, he was most praised. His family has been most praised as that beacon or that place that is different in the region. And now I see a conspicuous and visible deterioration. Let me see if there's someone else that may be, including Mr. Nassif.
Mr. McInerney and Mr. Nassif might want to respond.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you, Congresswoman. I'd be happy to jump in. First, I would just fully agree with what Sarah Lee Whitson just said. That I think the important thing is that we should try to help Jordan. We should try to help the Jordanian people. We should also try to help the many refugees from other countries in Jordan. You mentioned Palestinians, also many Syrians and Iraqis as well. So we should try to help the people. We shouldn't confuse that. We shouldn't with helping the king at all times. Now, the reality is that the Jordanian absolute monarchy dictatorship has steadily become more and more repressive over the 20 plus years of the king's rule. And the king and his regime receive extensive support from the United States. It's one of the largest recipients of U.S. assistance in the world at more than $1 billion annually. And I do believe that this should provide us leverage with the king if we are willing to use it. And unfortunately, sadly, most of the time, U.S. policymakers are not willing to use the leverage that our relationship with these regimes, I think does provide. I think we need to make very clear that it's in the interest of the United States and most all in the interest of the Jordanian people that the king and his regime absolutely reverse ground on this steady escalation of political closure and repression of rights and repression of any dissenting voices. One of the sad realities in the Middle East is that most of these dictatorships are not only brutal abusers of human rights, but they are also incompetent regimes incapable of meeting the needs of their people. And I think we've seen that very clearly in Jordan, which is, including over the past year, we've seen disastrous government response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in recent weeks, we've seen the government really target and arrest and confine to house arrest anyone who has criticized their response. I think the reality is that the way to solve the problems of Jordan or in other countries is to allow the citizens to kind of engage in finding solutions and not to silence any dissenting voices. And these regimes are brittle and insecure, and the king is terrified of his own population and of any dissenting voices or criticism. I think we need to see a very, very different approach from the king and his dictatorship. And if not, then I think we should shift our support away from the king and find ways to directly engage in support with the Jordanian people and as I said, also with other refugee populations present in Jordan.
Thank you. Thank you all so very much. I think, I don't want to use the terminology, but we have our marching orders. We have our roadmap here.
Yeah, and I'm trying to see, did Mr. Nassif want to respond? On the Lebanon, I didn't. I'm trying
We
to.
don't want to leave you out, Mr. Nassif.
I'm trying to follow everybody on my Hollywood squares here, and it's really.
No, thank you all. Nothing more to add except to reiterate a very important point that I think all of the witnesses have brought up thus far, which is that the United States has leverage over many of these countries, and we do not use that leverage nearly enough. And I think that going forward, when Congressman Sheila Jackson-Lee asked that wonderful question of what could we do going forward, and you bring up marching orders, I think a part of those orders should be to use that leverage and make sure that human rights is a part of the conversation, not in a cosmetic way, but in a substantive way. Free the political prisoners that we've all discussed in our opening testimonies. Stop shooting protesters in the streets. Allow equal access to healthcare in the midst of a pandemic. These are the kinds of things that the United States can ask for and has not been asking historically of some of our close partners in the region, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, and others. And I think it's time that changes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah,
Go back. Thank you, Chairman.
I can't wait till we all can meet in person in a hearing room so I could see everybody. But in any event, I think Ms. Omar, I think, has joined us, and I will yield to her for any comments or questions she may have.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman McGovern, and it's grateful to Sheila for asking all of the questions I wanted to ask. But I am just delighted to be here. This is, I think, one of the most illuminating hearings I've been part of, and just really grateful to all of the panelists for their powerful testimonies. And I wanted to direct my first question to, and I might do the Sheila thing and butcher names here, but Mr. McInerney, am I saying that correctly? Okay. I found your testimony to be quite powerful, and I was interested in a point that you made about the rhetoric of the so-called stability, in which is often a euphemism for supporting dictatorships. I wanted to see if you wanted to say a little bit more about how our historical support for dictatorships in the region has actually been destabilizing.
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. I would just start by saying that I think fundamentally, the number one source of instability, violence, radicalization, terrorism in the world is the brutal repression of dictatorship. And I think that the approach of the United States, of supposedly trying to partner with brutal dictatorships in the region in order to combat terrorism, is so deeply fundamentally flawed and kind of inherently contradictory and inherently doomed to fail. And I would highlight that, in the years immediately following the September 11th attacks in 2001, there was a lot of empirical research done on the root causes of terrorism and the connections between terrorism and a variety of factors, the level of poverty and socioeconomic development, education, as well as political factors. And both at the individual level, the national level, and the single most conclusive and statistically significant result of these studies was that individuals who engage in terrorism are far more likely to be from countries ruled by repressive authoritarian regimes that abuse the human rights of their citizens. And there are logical explanations for what this data showed. Essentially, when people are abused and repressed, they are more likely to turn to violence. When there are no opportunities for legitimate, peaceful, nonviolent political engagement, people are far more likely to resort to trying to engage politically through violent acts of terrorism. Unfortunately, I think these important findings have been largely neglected by the Washington policy community. And sadly, as I hinted at in my opening remarks, I think the main reason for that is that many influential actors here in Washington prefer to engage in corrupt business dealings with these dictatorships than acknowledge the fact that they are rampantly fueling terrorism. And so I think that these abusive dictatorships are absolutely a source of instability. I think it is folly to imagine that we can provide enormous quantities of weapons to these regimes and imagine that will bring peace or security or stability. And what we're seeing is the opposite. We had this policy in place, this approach for decades, and over those decades, the level of violence in the region has steadily grown, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. And tragically, here in Washington, it's like we're fueling these regimes that breed instability and terrorism and violence, and then we use that terrorism and violence that we are fueling to justify further weapon sales and kind of further support for these dictatorships as a response in this really dangerous kind of vicious cycle. So I think we need to absolutely kind of rethink the way that we think about terrorism and stability. And if I could add one final point, I also mentioned earlier that I believe that dictatorships should in fact be viewed as terrorist entities themselves. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that just because I dislike them and think that therefore I should call them terrorists. Terrorism is defined as the use of violence and political force, or the threat of violence for political purposes, and particularly to inspire terror and fear in opponents. And this is precisely the mechanism by which dictators and authoritarian rulers maintain power. To take as an example, there's been referenced several times today the horrific murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudi regime. What is this if not an act of international terrorism? And I wouldn't say that every murder is an act of international terrorism, but this was clearly a murder by the Saudi regime that was done not only to eliminate Jamal, not only to eliminate a dissident, a critic of the regime, but also clearly to inspire fear and terror among Saudi citizens, both inside the kingdom and elsewhere around the world, and to show that even residents of the United States, Saudi residents of the United States or Europe or anywhere who dare to criticize the thuggish rule and the murderous dictatorship of their own country will be targeted. This is precisely terrorism, and should be viewed as such.
Yeah. So I'm curious, and maybe this is to Sarah and to you. I know you've all talked a lot about credibility and the way forward in regards to some of the things that we've gotten wrong in supporting democratic movements during the Arab Spring. And I'm wondering if there is a correlation between the credibility we are trying to seek and trying to create stability with people, because regimes can't have stability unless the people believe in the legitimacy and are able to have a voice themselves within their government. And the fact that we have supported dictators and those that we believed would be supportive to us and be good allies for us, even though they might be brutalizing the people that they support. So I'm thinking about countries like Egypt, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and even Jordan, where we didn't really support the people, but we supported these regimes in comparison to countries where there was a change and we didn't support the change there.
Stephen, go ahead.
Sure. Look, as I said, I think that, I think it's honestly, it's folly to even consider some of these brutal repressive regimes as allies. I think that word is thrown around too lightly. I think that we have allies. I think allies, genuine allies, are countries that we not only do business with and have transactional relationships with, but that we also share fundamental values with. And I think that a lot of the relationships that we have with many of the governments that we've been discussing and that you mentioned are not kind of true, alliances. They're sort of transactional relationships that really contradict our most important values. And so I think it's really important that we dramatically change the way that we think about the region and the way that we engage with the region and the actors in the region that we choose to partner with. And maybe again, just to use Saudi Arabia as an example, I was just talking about the sort of really brutal acts by that horrific regime. Just to emphasize, I mean, according to the Freedom House scores and rankings, Saudi Arabia is one of the 8 most brutal dictatorships in the world. Its citizens have fewer rights than almost any other country in the world. Its peers are countries like North Korea, Somalia, Syria, countries that are never spoken about positively and certainly not supported by our government. But Saudi Arabia has received more weapons from the United States government over the past decade, around $90 billion in weapons. That's more than any other country in the world has received from any other country in the world. And we should be outraged by that. We should not be fully, unconditionally supporting one of the world's most despicable, loathsome dictatorships by providing, just kind of flooding that regime with weapons. And so I think we need to just fundamentally change the entire way that we think about and engage with the region. And also, just to harken back to my opening remarks, I think the biggest obstacle to that kind of fundamental rethinking and changing of policy is the corrupt influence of a lot of these regimes here in Washington. So if we want to change what's happening in the Middle East, we also have to be willing to seriously fight and kind of combat the work of lobbyists and kind of communications firms and so many others that are on the payroll of these really odious regimes here in DC.
How do we do that? How do we fight the PR machines of these regimes that are sort of making them not who they really are to citizens of this country and to our colleagues in Congress?
Yeah, so first, I mean, one recommendation that I mentioned very briefly that I could expand upon is that we should make it illegal for anyone who engages in these kind of acts of PR and lobbying on behalf of dictatorships, make it illegal for those people to then work for the US government. Because the reality is that many policymakers, people in key positions at the State Department, the White House, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, when they're not in government, they are often paid by these dictatorships. And that affects their behavior when they're on the payroll of these dictatorships, but it also affects their behavior when they're serving the US government. One of the most common ways to cash in following retirement for US diplomats and other officials is to join the payroll of the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or Qatar. And the reality is that while many of these people are in government, they're essentially auditioning for their next job. They're supporting these awful dictatorships and ensuring that they receive tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons and financial support and political support. And they know that if they do so, then they'll have a payday coming when they want to leave government. That's outrageous. And those who serve the United States government should not be allowed, when they leave government, to work for any entity, any business, any company, any organization that is funded by dictatorships. And those who have worked for dictatorships should not be allowed allowed to work for the U.S. government. So I would encourage you all to initiate legislation to require that. And in the meantime, until legislation is passed, I encourage you to work with your Senate to oppose the nomination, to oppose political appointments to anyone who has been paid by any of these odious regimes.
I'll come in briefly on this, because I think it sounds like such an obvious point, but a lot of this comes back to facts, which we've lost some of the respect for over the past years. But hearings like this, in which people can actually hear from reputable organizations about what the facts are on the ground, listening to human rights defenders when they tell the United States what is happening. Two other mechanisms, the State Department's Human Rights Bureau, Democracy, Rights and Labor, DRL, has a mandate to be collecting these kinds of facts about human rights situations on the ground and puts out an annual human rights report. They have also done investigations into particular rights abusing contexts, like what happened to the Rohingya in Burma. That is something that the US government has the power to do, is to investigate and to look into what's happening on the ground. Similarly, the UN has a mechanism through the Office of the High Commissioner to look into what is happening in Ethiopia's Tigray region, Xinjiang, China, perhaps what's happening in Saudi Arabia. These are things for which people in offices have a mandate, and they have that for a reason. So the United States and its policymakers need to be supporting those mandates.
Yeah, and if I could just add another point or two on this very important question that you've raised, Congresswoman. In addition, I've mentioned just a moment ago kind of the importance of preventing those who engage in this kind of despicable lobbying from working in the U.S. executive branch. The reality is the same applies to the Congress that you're a part of. And the sad reality is that many of your colleagues in Congress leave Congress and lobby for odious regimes. And I would, just to give a couple of the dozens of examples, two of the recent chairs of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, former Congressman Ed Royce, former Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Leighton, both of whom I respected when they were in Congress, upon leaving Congress, disgraced themselves by becoming lobbyists for brutal dictatorships, for Egypt and for the United Arab Emirates. And when your former colleagues, former members of Congress who disgrace themselves in this way, reach out to you all and kind of engage and want meetings where they want to advance the interests of these odious actors, refuse to meet with them, refuse to engage with them, and certainly refuse their requests on behalf of these governments. And I think you should be plain with them that this kind of behavior is a stain and on our country and on the U.S. Congress itself.
Thank you. Whitson, were you going to add something?
I didn't realize I could be seen. I mean, just to add to that, in the interim, before we can have serious reform of the laws that allow this disgraceful revolving door and corruption of our politics, where our own foreign policy making is not in the national interest, but in the interests of paid lobbyists of foreign governments, I would urge any member of Congress who meets or talks to any registered lobbyists from the Middle East to, on the same day, meet with someone affected by the policies of their heinous government that they are working for. And each of our organizations can help make that happen. It should be a rule that you force yourself to hear from people, from independent people, from unpaid people, nonprofit people about what's happening on the ground. And in the same way, when our members of Congress accept junkets to travel to the Middle East, paid for by governments or government-aligned organizations, they should insist on meeting with political activists in the region. They should insist on visiting prisons. If they travel to Israel, they should insist on visiting the West Bank and visiting Gaza. And if that request cannot be accommodated, they should not take that trip, because our members of Congress have a responsibility as well not to allow themselves to be used as little PR coins.
And Chairman, if I may, Whitson, I know earlier you were being asked about some political prisoners that you were advocating for, and whether you believed in women's rights and the such. And I find it fascinating to Stephen's point, right? We would put countries like Somalia and others that are on the list with Saudi Arabia as countries that we should be having conversations about. We shouldn't be thinking about as allies. They're countries that should be condemned for any of the violations that they're having in regards to human rights. But those that we think are our allies, our friends, who have really smart PR firms and have former congressional colleagues lobbying for them, are the ones that we don't speak of. And so I wanted to give you the opportunity to sort of speak to what that sort of hypocrisy being spoken in committees like this in Congress, in Washington, says to the people who want to see us as their advocates, and people who are led by the principles and standards of fighting for human rights around the world.
Yeah, I would say that we as Americans have to treat our reputation, our standing, our credibility, the real meaning of leadership, which is leadership and values, as a national asset. And to take policies and actions that damage that asset of our reputation as honorable, principled actors who mean what we say, who act in a way that supports the values we purport to stand for. That's a national asset, and wasting that asset, as we have been doing in supporting brutal governments, apartheid governments, abusive governments in the Middle East, has caused the United States tremendous harm. I was just recounting how many decades ago I backpacked across Egypt. I backpacked across many parts of the Middle East with an American flag on my backpack, proudly displayed as a patch, the biggest patch among the other countries I had visited. And that's something that my kids couldn't do today without feeling that there's a target on their back, because America's policies have become associated with wrongdoing in Iraq, wrongdoing in Israel, wrongdoing in Yemen. And that is something that is very damaging to the American people. And we need to restore, we need to rebuild. And I want to give one other example of what it means to have American standing. When the Derek Chauvin verdict was announced around the world, messages from around the world on Twitter, messages to the brothers of George Floyd flooded in, and his brothers thanked people around the world for standing with him. This went such a long way towards restoring America's reputation and standing. These issues are interconnected. When people see how we are mistreating Black and brown people in the United States, believe me, they see it a lot more how we're mistreating Black and brown people around the world in their own communities, in their own towns. When an American bomb falls on a primary school in Yemen, you can imagine that for Yemeni children, this is the harm they see. This is what they understand. And that is a cost to us that is not being factored in by our decision makers, by our policymakers.
Thank you, Judith. Nassif, were you going to add something?
Yes, Congresswoman, thank you. A quick and final point to some of the human rights defenders that you have mentioned. I think, and to the issue of the lobbyists, I think ultimately speaking, no government can buy its way out of the reality that exists on the ground in the region. And so I think going forward, when you all are able to travel again and visit some of these countries in the region that are allies of the United States or that claim to be allies of the United States. So I'm talking about Egypt, talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other countries. Ask to meet, if they are willing to do so, ask to meet with some of the human rights defenders that are either detained or under house arrest, or ask to meet with some of the media outlets that have seen their offices raided by the ruling governments over and over again and seen some of the reporters killed. Give the interviews that you would maybe give to larger outlets to some of the independent reporters, whom are some of the few remaining on the ground documenting these human rights abuses. Show that they are heard and that they exist, because ultimately the greatest asset that these governments have is that the American public doesn't know that some of these wonderful human rights activists and organizations actually exist on the ground. Even though their numbers are dwindling, most people don't know that. And that is the greatest opportunity for these governments to continue to crack down on these people. And eventually we will have no one left to do some of the great work that is being done. So, I ask all of you, different from some of the other ideas about, preventing former members from lobbying and all of this sort of stuff, which is fine. Ultimately, the power that you all have when you're visiting these countries can be doubled when you give opportunity to meet with some of these activists and ensure that the United States embassies, including these organizations, in conversations consistently with those host governments as well. Thank you.
And if I could just echo that, I just wanted to kind of fully endorse and agree with the importance of engaging with these countries beyond engaging with the regimes, the dictators that rule them. And Congresswoman Jackson Lee, mentioned earlier, kind of traveling on coattails and choosing to be the skunk at the table by raising human rights with government officials. I think that's very important. Encourage her to continue to play that role. Encourage you always to raise these issues when you're engaging with the government. But as important or more important is, as Philippe just said, and as Sarah Lee said as well, engage much broader than that. Like these regimes are the minority in their country. Like most of the citizens of the country are the victims of the regimes. And we should engage with these countries broadly. We should talk with independent voices, meet with independent voices, journalists, academics, political opposition, dissidents, activists, including, as was said, kind of those who are detained and imprisoned, and kind of send, solidarity and support and listen to them, listen to their concerns. And I think far too often members of Congress and also of the executive branch allow their opinions of this region to be dictated by what they hear from their government counterparts. So I really encourage you to kind of engage with and listen to all these other voices. And our organization, and I think all the other organizations represented up here today, are always more than happy to help connect you with independent voices apart from the regimes in these countries, both on visits, on congressional delegations to these countries. And also there are so many important voices from these countries in exile here in the United States, here in the Washington, D.C. area and elsewhere.
Really appreciate that. Thank you. I yield back.
Well, thank you. So I think I'm the last person here to question, and I apologize that I have a few questions for everybody here. And I know this has been a long hearing, but it's been a passionate hearing. I've heard a lot today about the lack of consistency in U.S. policy, especially with regard to human rights. And I'm trying to remember, and I was a history major in college, when the last time we had a consistent policy. That we treated human rights the same way with regard to our friends and our allies. And I can't remember. I don't think we ever have. I mean, there's always been this inconsistency. That doesn't make it right. But I think there has been this inconsistency. And I've been on this commission now for a long time. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that human rights has never really and truly been the centerpiece of how the U.S. approaches the entire world. We're very selective. We pick and choose, oftentimes. And I'm troubled by that, but I look through my record, I'm sure you can point to inconsistencies in how I've approached these issues with various countries around the world. we say human rights is the centerpiece of, we say that human rights should be the focus of our policy, and then we, then we can point to these inconsistencies. I watch, like all of you, we all watch. There's so many news programs now, but you always have these talking heads who come on who are former State Department officials or experts on some foreign affairs think tank will come on, and when the issue of human rights gets brought up, they'll sometimes say, yeah, no, that's true, but we have to be pragmatic. We have to put our interests first. And to some, that's appealing. But, if you're in the country that we're going to overlook human rights abuses in, and you're being put in jail because, you decide to worship in a different way than the government wants you to, or you say something or blog something that the government takes offense by, and you're put in jail and you're tortured, well, that's not a very good outcome. And I've always been puzzled why, we can't walk and chew gum at the same time when it comes to human rights. I mean, I think we can work with, let's say, China, for example, on the climate crisis, but that should not preclude us from every chance we get talking about the Uyghurs or what's happening in Hong Kong or the Tibetans. And in terms of how we treat our allies when it comes to human rights, I've always been puzzled why we've been so hesitant to raise these issues to them, because I've always thought that if you're an ally, you're my friend. And if you're my friend and you're doing something that I think is self-defeating, that is not in your long-term interest, that will weaken you down the road, if I don't say something to you, then I'm not a very good friend. And I think, this has been a problem with Republican administrations and with Democratic administrations over the years. So this is not a Republican versus Democratic issue at all. We say we want democracy. We want people to be able to determine their future. But we have to make it clear that if you choose someone we don't like, that's your choice. Because we can't say we only favor democracy and self-determination if you pick people that we approve of. And so, I realize all this is very, very complicated, but I really do think at some point we need to address this issue of consistency because it gives us more credibility. And I think it gives us more power to be able to impact change. When I was a young congressional aide, we did a lot of work in Central America, and there were some pretty brutal governments in the 1980s. El Salvador, for example, but we backed them militarily because they made a promise that they would fight against any revolution that we all perceived to be left-leaning or communist-leaning or whatever. We thought that somehow Russia or Cuba were responsible for all the revolution, as if you could export revolution like you export a bale of cotton. You can't, right? There were internal struggles going on that were getting people to rise up and to want change. In the case of Iran, I think there's a case to be made that all those years of backing the brutal regime of the Shah of Iran may have created the circumstances, and very well have created the circumstances that led to the Ayatollah coming into power. So, to pick and choose and to be selective on the issue of human rights, sometimes, we create the conditions where we end up with bad, worst case scenarios. So I struggle all the time. I mean, when I talk to, even the current administration on, why aren't you doing this or why aren't you doing that? And people say, well, we have to be careful about this and be careful about that. I understand the complexities of relationships with other countries. But on the issue of human rights, we ought to be consistent. You can still deal with a country and on a range of other issues, arms control, climate change, whatever, and still focus on human rights. And I also agree that on the issue of military, we send so much military aid around the world, and I'm not sure whether it's because people don't understand the damage that it does, or because we have so many jobs here in the United States that now rely on constructing those weapons, and we have campaign finance laws that allow people to weigh in and influence members of Congress in all different ways. But whatever. I mean, I would like a foreign policy that was based more on addressing issues of extreme poverty and hunger. I mean, I think I have this kind of radical idea that if you actually support things that help people and lift people up, then people will like you. And if people like you, they won't want to blow you up. So in any event, that's my kind of take on kind of the current situation. I mean, the inconsistencies in our approach to the world, I think have damaged our credibility on the issue of human rights, and have lessened our ability to influence things in a way, quite frankly, that protects the rights of all people. So let me just go through a series of questions here. So I'll begin with Mr. Nassif. You seem optimistic that the MENA region has found its voice, and that the shift in political imagination among young people is irreversible. What are the implications of this for U.S. foreign policy? Are there opportunities for the U.S. to engage the young people in the region in a constructive way without undermining their credibility?
Yes, Chairman, thank you very much for the question. I do believe that the young women and men of the region no longer fear their governments in the way that they have feared them for so long. I think it is why we are seeing so many bouts of mass demonstrations and unrest that have continued, maybe to a smaller degree during the pandemic, but then are once again starting to build up on the streets of various capitals in the region. We don't expect, I certainly don't expect that to go away anytime soon, because the same grievances that led them to revolt in the first place after when the Arab Spring began have largely been unaddressed. The economic, the socio-political grievances, the human rights violations that occur on a daily basis, all of these things are still happening to various degrees, or have gotten much worse in a slew of countries across the MENA region. I think that the United States government at this point should just acknowledge that this unrest is going to continue unless there is a radical change in the approach between the United States government and governments of the Middle East and North Africa, where we have leverage over close allied countries like Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states that I've mentioned, Egypt and Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco. We need to sit down, include civil society leaders, not make the decision for them that it's too dangerous for them to meet with the United States. Let them make the decision, because oftentimes most of these activists would love to be included in the conversation, but aren't asked out of fear of them being harmed by their host government. When we ask them if that's the right approach, they simply say, we'd rather be there, and if we get arrested afterwards, it's better than getting arrested alone on a dark street, which is likely going to happen to some of us anyway. So we cannot make these decisions for them. I think we need to include them in these conversations with our embassies across the region. I think with visiting delegations of members of Congress are visiting these countries, they should also be meeting with these young women and men, these media outlets, these civil society groups. And I think that we need to continue to hold hearings like this more frequently, because this ultimately, as the other witnesses have pointed out, allows us to lay out all of the various human rights challenges that are taking place in the region, and put forward various ideas to address these challenges. There are several bills that exist right now, like the Libya Stabilization Act, that can make a difference. It sends a strong message that the United States cares about human rights violations and war crimes. And there are plenty of other pieces of legislation that I think the other witnesses could bring up as well that would address and begin to address this radical departure that I'm referring to, and bring that consistency that we're all talking about into U.S. foreign policy, and help support these young women and men who have found their voice across the region.
Thank you. Ms. Lewinsky, in your testimony, you referred to the role women have played in changing law and practices throughout the region. Can you say more about women's leadership in the region? Is there more the U.S. should be doing, or more Congress could, to encourage, with regard to strengthening women's pro-human rights advocacy and leadership?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I would love to get back to you with details about how women are changing the Middle East and what the U.S. can do more so. But just to say, I think, when U.S. officials call out various human rights abuses, they need to be calling out the abuses against women far more often. And simply doing that would make such a big difference. And I'm sorry for the noise in the background, so I'll keep my response short.
It's okay. It's okay. Mr. Tadros, you recommend that the U.S. pay special attention to freedom of the press and independent media. What's the best way to do this, given that journalists and bloggers and others are often targets for repression?
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think in the past, we've spoken out when these media outlets have been targeted. An example such as MENA in Egypt, which has been repeatedly targeted by Egyptian authorities whenever they felt that they can get away with it. And every time that the US and other countries have raised this issue, we've been able to stop the attack on such an organization. There are many other organizations. Obviously, the oppression is not going to disappear. This is a constant threat to those regimes because they make sure that their people don't listen to anything else, that they're the only providers of the narrative. So for them, that's a very important thing. And speaking out on behalf of these courageous voices, I think, is very important. But also, as I mentioned, using the tools in our own arsenal. The US Embassy in Cairo needs to be speaking out against all those falsehoods put out by the Egyptian regime's media, official media, that talks about a US conspiracy against Egypt. This is not the conduct of a US ally. So such actions, by using our own tools to provide information, to give the facts on the ground to people, I think would play a very important role in making citizens in those countries aware of the situation in their own countries and making better choices about their own future.
Thank you. Ms. Whitson, so you argue in your testimony that the U.S. should end its military support of Egypt and Israel, and that providing so-called defensive weapons to Saudi and UAE only emboldens unaccountable leaders. So I myself have called for an end to arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But for the record, how do you respond to those whose priority is countering designated terrorist groups in the region? I mean, how do you respond to the security arguments that always get raised and the priority placed on counterterrorism cooperation?
A couple of ways. I think we have to first recognize and understand that the military support that the United States provides to Egypt and Israel for free, while we don't have money to provide clean water to our own school children in America, as well as the arms sales that we are providing to Saudi Arabia and Yemen, have actually very little to do with any sort of counterterrorism operations. We are selling the most advanced and sophisticated weaponry, missiles, equipment that really has little use in the sorts of counterterrorism operations that will have any meaningful sense or use for a country like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, where the battle is really about intelligence gathering, using regular criminal laws to go after regular criminal offenders. This goes far beyond that. And anyone who pretends that we have to sell Saudi Arabia tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars because somehow that constitutes counterterrorism cooperation is really not telling the truth. That's not what this weaponry is about. It is about providing the military and diplomatic backing and support for one side in a regional contest where we believe the unelected governments, be more sympathetic and aligned with interests that we have defined for the region. It really isn't about counterterrorism cooperation. And also, there's no reason why counterterrorism cooperation can't continue without providing this military assistance to Egypt or Israel, for example. There's no reason why we can't share training, share united operations against actual terrorism. But that's not what's happening, and that's not what this is about.
Mr. Mcinerney, in your testimony, you identify the escalation of corrupt use of funds as the most dangerous development regarding U.S. policy toward the MENA region. Can you elaborate a little bit, and how does this work? Are you able to provide some examples for the committee? Okay.
Sure. Thank you for your question, Congressman. So the reality is this is very complex and multifaceted efforts by these regimes to use corrupt funds to buy influence here in Washington. It's also often a very opaque business, and so I can't give you, not all the details are visible, but I can give you some examples. So, it was mentioned earlier. I believe you mentioned kind of that you see talking heads on television who will say, yes, there are human rights abuses and we should be concerned about that, but we need to be pragmatic. The reality is that most of the time, these talking heads work for organizations funded by these regimes and are funded in order to deflect from human rights abuses and to defend failing policies in the name of pragmatism and otherwise. And these regimes fund most of the think tanks here in Washington. I would commend you and the Lantos Commission in this hearing, and this is a rare congressional hearing about the Middle East and North Africa that does not include witnesses from organizations funded by dictatorships. Most of the time that on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the Armed Services Committee, most of those hearings normally include witnesses who are essentially being funded to justify policies of support for these dictatorships. So that's one example. I would also say universities. So many universities, most of the top universities, so many of the universities in this country are funded by these dictatorships. And as a result, you have scholars and analysts and academics who are put forth as experts on these issues who have an incentive to justify these policies. That's very dangerous. Also, in the media coverage, media narratives, very often journalists will cite experts who might be former members of Congress, former secretaries of defense, secretaries of state, who are now paid consultants or lobbyists for these governments. And so these governments sort of pollute the information space while also kind of undertaking explicit lobbying efforts. So there are also lobbyists up on Capitol Hill every day representing these governments and making corrupt deals with many of your colleagues in Congress. There are, lobbyists for governments will meet and will make contributions to campaigns and on the same day demand that members of Congress kind of weaken efforts to hold their clients, these dictatorships, accountable for these horrific abuses. So it's a very thorough, exhaustive, kind of multifaceted approach. I mentioned earlier kind of the corrosive influence of the fact that many people who work at these organizations and firms paid for by these dictatorships also go in and out of government. And so they carry on kind of to defend these policies when they're outside of government, and then they go into government. You mentioned, I commend you also for acknowledging that this is certainly a bipartisan issue. These issues are not unique to either party, either on Capitol Hill or in the executive branch. Every time there's a change in administration, there's a new set of political appointees brought in to key policy making roles. And whether the Democratic Party or Republican Party is in charge, many of those people have close ties to these dictatorships that use this sort of corruption to influence our policy. So I think it's all of this, I think, is very dangerous. As I said, I believe this is actually the single #1 driver of U.S. policy toward the region, is this sort of multifaceted kind of use of corruption. And I also think this has worsened dramatically over the past decade.
Thanks. And I just have a couple more questions, and this is open-ended to whoever wants to answer it. In recent years, the U.S. government has relied increasingly on the use of sanctions, both targeted and sectoral or secondary, to influence behavior of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and elsewhere. In your view, which, if any, sanctions initiatives have been successful or effective, and why? And when describing the rationale for sanctions, U.S. officials and members of Congress often describe them as a way to hold human rights abusers accountable for their actions. In what sense or to what degree are sanctions an accountability mechanism? Under what conditions do they contribute to fulfilling victims' rights? What more should the U.S. do to promote accountability for victims of human rights abuses? As you know, Co-Chair Smith and I are the co-authors of the Global Magnitsky Act, which allows targeted sanctions against individuals, that are responsible for formulating, oppressive policies. That's not across the board. Everybody gets sanctioned, that oftentimes punishes the people. But in any event, I hope if everybody or whoever wants to answer this, I open it's hard to see everybody. So you're just gonna have to say, I want to say something because I can't see you.
Well, I want to chime in,
Sarah,
if I may, with your
Yes. Yep.
permission.
I see you. Okay.
The issue of sanctions is one I have worked on for many, many decades, starting first with the broad-based U.S. sanctions imposed on Iraq, following the first Gulf War, and leading through the second Gulf War, U.S. military invasion and occupation of Iraq. First and foremost, there's a huge distinction between the individual sanctions, such as under the Global Magnitsky Act, that I think are a good and valuable tool for accountability. And really, they only have two impacts. One is to say, you can't come to America. And two is to say, you can't do business in America. That is the real effect of the asset freezes and the travel bans that the Magnitsky Act sanctions authorize, and that we at Dawn certainly fully support and advocate for. They are part of a rigorous review of evidence that is targeted towards individuals. There is a robust due process review of people who are subject to these sanctions. That is completely different from the countrywide unilateral sanctions that the United States has imposed on Iraq, to devastating effect, leading to mass casualties, infant mortality in Iraq, and vastly different from the countrywide sanctions imposed on Iran, which are devastating the Iranian people's economy and harming the Iranian people, as are the sanctions imposed against Syria. They are never effective. They have never been effective as an actual policy tool to obtain the political demands for which they have been used. The so-called maximum pressure campaign that Trump maximally took was a complete disaster and did not succeed in any of its goals. None of the goals that were set out in sanctions policy against Iraq worked. So they're ineffective, but what's worse is they're inhumane. And I refer you to a brilliant article in the Boston Review of Books that reviews US sanctions policy around the world. The dozens of countries where the US has unilaterally imposed countrywide sanctions, almost entirely in countries made up of Black and brown people. They are harmful. They hurt civilians. They hurt the people we sometimes ostensibly try to support. And as a human rights activist, I should say that they're also instrumentalized, claiming to be for the purpose of human rights, when in fact they are tied to political ends that have nothing to do with the interests of the targeted population.
Thank you. No. Anybody else want to say anything on this?
Sure, I'd be happy to
Go ahead, Mr. McInerney.
Yeah, thank you. I'd be happy to add to that. I mean, I strongly agree with Sarah Lee Whitson that targeted individual sanctions can be effective. The kind of broad-based sanctions that she just described are often very detrimental, and in fact can often be used by these regimes to deflect popular dissatisfaction with their own ineptitude and economic mismanagement. They often will blame the country's economic woes on these sanctions and blame the United States. And sometimes this can kind of deflect from their own domestic opposition. On the other hand, the targeted sanctions I think are very important. I commend you for your efforts on the Global Magnitsky Act, which we strongly support. And we think it's a very important, relatively new tool. We'd like to see that being used much more broadly. But I would also emphasize that the importance of applying Global Magnitsky and other individual targeted sanctions to the real perpetrators. And just to use an example, the Biden administration recently sort of announced its Khashoggi ban on 76 Saudi that it considered to have some responsibility for egregious human rights abuses, including the awful murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But they excluded from that list of banned and sanctioned individuals the individual that at the same time they were releasing intelligence reports from the U.S. government saying that the individual who bears responsibility for that murder is the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And so if these individual sanctions are to really be effective, we should not exclude individuals that many people here in Washington have relationships with when they are really the primary individuals guilty of these crimes. Someone like Mohammed bin Salman will just replace the individuals who work for him, who carry out his orders, and those abuses will continue. So I think we need to elevate the level at which these individual targeted sanctions are applied. Thank you.
I have one more question, and then I'll yield to Mr. Smith for any closing remarks before we close this hearing. But many of the authoritarian regimes in the MENA region use counterterrorism laws to cloak their repressive measures. But these laws are inconsistent with emerging international norms for balancing counterterrorism with the protection of human rights. Should the U.S. take the initiative to work with regimes to review their counterterrorism laws to bring them into compliance with international standards? Could that be a useful thing to do?
Sir, if I may
Yep.
respond on this one, it's Sarah Holowinski from Human Rights Watch. Yes, the counterterrorism laws have been incredibly destructive for human rights around the world. U.S. laws and other laws. So U.S. policy making, as speaking as somebody who was at the State Department and the Pentagon before coming to Human Rights Watch, the entire bureaucracy has been formed since 9/11 around counterterrorism. That is the priority. That is what gets weight. That is how decisions are made, even if the topic in the particular interagency meeting is not counterterrorism. But offices have been set up, people's reporting requirements, all of these different things have been set up as such to cater to counterterrorism. And so we have a lot of work to do here in the United States to dismantle that. And then to, yes, absolutely make sure that counterterrorism policies around the world are not doing the same thing. And I just wanted to pull back for a minute to your bigger point, which I thought was so good about the consistency in US policy and how it has really never been consistent. I would agree with that, though I would say that the vacillations in this very recent era are pretty extreme. And it makes, of course, other countries not trust us. It makes populations not trust us, especially those who are seeking support for freedom and the human rights that they are trying to earn. Human rights, I don't think, is ever going to be the focus or organizing principle around US policy. But as I said before, it should be at the table. It should be a consideration. And when I look at, trade negotiations, for example, and the United States can go in and say, well, we need to protect our workers, or we need to protect our bottom line. Why is it that in similar negotiations or diplomatic arrangements, the US can't say, you know, we need to protect human rights. It is very much the same thing, especially if we look at human rights not as a short-term win or goal, but over the long term as just as pragmatically and strategically valuable to the United States as economic superiority, national security. You know, human rights feeds the rest of it. And when you don't have human rights, you have more conflict, you have disenfranchisement, specifically the kind of disenfranchisement that leads to the Arab Spring in the first place. So I just wanted to foot stomp that point that you made about trying to get more consistent, but certainly not vacillating as much as we have in recent years.
No, and I appreciate that. And on the issue of trade, I agree with you. And we've some of us have tried. Anyone else have anything else to add before we? All right.
Yeah, hey, Congressman.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Stephen McInerney. Yeah. Thank you. I would just like to add briefly to that. You know, I think absolutely, you know, we should, as you proposed, try to work with these governments to improve their counterterrorism laws. But we should also acknowledge that most of these governments are not interested in changing their counterterrorism laws, and that most of these governments see political opposition and pro-democracy, pro-human rights activists in their countries as a much greater threat to their own grip on power than non-state terrorist actors. And so not only should we try to work with them to improve their counterterrorism laws, but we should be willing to pressure them and kind of be tough with them, particularly those that we have close relationships with, and make clear that there will be consequences for their relationship with the United States if they refuse to move these laws in a positive direction. Thank you.
Well, let me yield to Mr. Smith for any closing comments he may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, Ms. Holensky, I couldn't agree more, and I and others have been saying it for our entire careers, that human rights needs to be integrated at its core, and that goes for arms control, that goes for nuclear. I held a number of hearings on North Korea, 7 of them so far, and then we had one on South Korea just the other day. But the idea of separating human rights from that discussion, and we did the same thing with Iran. I had 2 hearings, frankly, with Abedini, the pastor, when his wife went to the State Department and was told, sadly, and this is not partisan, by John Kerry's people, that there's nothing they can do to help him. Here's a pastor who was in prison, and like others in the Iranian prisons, being very much mistreated. And the idea was, well, how can we believe them on nuclear, or I would say the same thing for intellectual property rights and contract law with China, if they will not respect their own people and respect their own fundamental human rights. So it has to be ever present, and I think your point was well taken. I couldn't agree more with it. So thank you for that. Let me also say, Mr. McInerney's, your point and others about these members of Congress, Senate and House. You know, Mark Begich is also working for Egypt. So you got Democrats and Republicans upon leaving this chamber and the chamber across the way. I'm actually in my office in Washington right now. They go to work for despotic regimes. And, it's been a problem that I know my co-chair and I have worked against for years because they bring a certain credibility. They have access, very often. I'll never forget Ron Brown, the former Secretary of Commerce, when he was representing in my early part of the career, the Duvalier regime in Haiti, a terrible, despicable regime. He was with Patton Boggs at the time. And when he would come up to the Hill, we listen. He said, well, he's got credibility. So, and I think that equally applies to the NGO world as well, as to, where the money is coming from, as well as these organizations like Patton Boggs, who then hire members of Congress, House, and Senate. I'll never forget on a bill when I had met with Aliyev in Baku on 2 occasions, raised human rights, introduced a bill to release the political prisoners, including a Radio Free Asia correspondent who was a stringer for us, who got 7 years in prison for pointing out the corruption of the Aliyev regime. And I had met him twice, face to face, raised human rights across the board with him. And all of a sudden, not Patton Boggs, what was the name of it'll come to me. The ambassador says, "Oh, I have to call, our corporate sponsor down here, the organization. Oh, what is it? It'll come." Then I get a phone call from them about his regime, and nice bullet points show up about how great he is, and so things like that. So your point was very well taken about that, and I appreciate that very much. Ms. Whitson, if I could ask you, I had read last March an article in which, let me just back up a second. Back in the early 80s, my first trip on human rights was to the Soviet Union on behalf of Soviet Jews who were being horrifically treated by the Soviet regime. And we met with Natan Sharansky's mother, because he was in Perm camp. And then a few years later, I actually went to Perm camp with Frank Wolf, another congressman. And how we got there, I could spend an hour talking about it, and I won't. But we met with all of these political and religious prisoners there. And when Sharansky got out, that's where he had spent so many years of his life. He testified at 2 of my 15 hearings on combating anti-Semitism. Now, why do I bring this up? He, at one of those, brought a video that was being shown throughout the Middle East and by satellite and the like, all over Europe and the United States and elsewhere, about blood libel, that horrific smear of the Israeli people, of the Jewish people everywhere, that the throat is cut, blood is dripped into matzah, and people then consume it. He showed that video, and you could have heard a pin drop from both sides of the aisle at my hearing. I couldn't believe that such lies could be perpetrated upon a large number of people, and to young people watching that, why wouldn't they believe it? Well, I saw you in 2020. I think you were still at the Quincy Institute, and this helps us know when you testify, where you're coming from, and I would appreciate your insights on this. That when one Twitter user foolishly compared the public health measures that Israel was taking towards the Palestinians on COVID-19, and they compared it to the Palestinians, you appeared to agree, but you also said it was missing a tablespoon of blood. Now that sounds to me, especially since I've been working the blood libel issue for 40 years, and I was really made even more aware of it by Natan Sharansky himself, that sounds like an awful lot like a connection to blood libel. Maybe you can explain that. You did pull down your tweet, and I do appreciate that you did that, but it would be helpful to us if you would do that. And secondly, we talk about malign influence, and I think Turkey is having a malign influence on many parts of the region. Now, not only do they have a horrific human rights abuse under Erdogan that goes on every day of the week, but they also are infamously known for how many journalists they jail. There's 160 media outlets that have been closed, over 200 journalists who have been imprisoned over the last 5 years, according to Reporters Without Borders. And I know others on this webinar, certainly, or this hearing, I should say, report on this as well. And I'm wondering, Ms. Whitson, if you have spoken out against that abuse by Erdogan. If you could answer those questions, I would appreciate anybody else who wants to jump in.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to address both these points.
Sure.
First of all, on the tweet, I think it's really disgusting and disgraceful how people can seek to twist any use of the word blood in connection with Israel or Palestine as tantamount or equivalent to this medieval concept or defamation of blood libel. It's absolutely ridiculous. The point of the tweet was to say that the lockdown, which is what the original tweeter was talking about, the lockdown in Israel, that she compared to the permanent lockdown of Gaza and the West Bank very accurately, was missing the violence that accompanies the lockdown in Gaza and the lockdown in the West Bank. That's why it was missing a tablespoon of blood. I'm very sorry that some people always associate any use of the word blood, all of a sudden seek to twist it into some kind of anti-Semitic attack. but clearly that was not what my words said and not what my words meant. And I have been a champion of anti-Semitism and anti-hatred and anti-discrimination of all types around the world, and condemn anti-Semitism. As a survivor of the Armenian genocide, I am very, very grateful that we have full recognition of the Jewish Holocaust. And I feel very personally and know very much the trauma of being a survivor of genocide, like the Jewish people have been, and like the Armenian people have been. And to that end, I am so tremendously grateful that President Biden finally recognized officially the Armenian genocide perpetrated by Ottoman authorities 106 years ago, which which orphaned my grandfather, who was from Diyarbakir, actually, then called Dikranagert. And it was my grandmother's family who were marched through the Deir Zor desert due to the genocide, and why my mother and my grandmother were born in refugee camps in Lebanon. That was directly tied to the Armenian genocide. So I am very, very familiar and understanding of what an ugly crime the crime of genocide is, of which, of course, the Holocaust was one, but not the only one. The term genocide.
Well, I would agree with you, because I actually read Morgenthau's book,
yes,
which was written
thank you for that.
contemporaneously. Held 2 hearings on it. It's terrible. Yeah.
As regards to the abuses of the Erdogan government, although Turkey is not formally in my ambit, neither in my work at Human Rights Watch, nor at my work at Dawn, given that we focused on the Middle East and North Africa, I have been a very strong critic of the Turkish government's jailing of critics, in particular, jailing of journalists, the world's second largest or largest jailer of journalists in the world, as well as my dear friend Osman Kavala, who has been detained for almost 3 years. And any effort you can make on his behalf, I would be tremendously grateful for, in a sham accusation somehow tying him to the Gezi protests, for which he was acquitted, following which they charged him with being a plotter of the coup, the failed coup in Turkey, which is absolutely ridiculous. My friends are jailed in Turkey. I don't need to be encouraged to condemn and critique the abuses of the Turkish government. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I would be happy to.
Yes.
Yeah, Congressman Smith, I'd be happy to just briefly respond as well.
Sure.
On the issue of Turkey, I echo Sarah Lee Whitson's very strong condemnation of the Erdogan regime, and I would also add that it's especially concerning to see Erdogan's increasing authoritarianism, given Turkey's status as a NATO ally. I've commented earlier that we often too casually use the term ally to refer to many of the countries that we have sort of transactional relationships and partnerships with. But Turkey is a genuine NATO ally, and Erdogan's increasing repression is in blatant violation of some of the founding principles of NATO, and we should be very alarmed and very strongly oppose that. And then lastly, I'd just like to commend you and Congressman McGovern for your efforts to combat some of this very nefarious lobbying. And certainly I agree with you that I'm appalled by Senator Begich and many others on both sides of the aisle who kind of joined the lobbying teams of Egypt and many of these other dictatorships. But so thank you for your efforts to combat that, and we would be happy to work with you on those issues further. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me thank everybody here today for your insights, for your recommendations, for the robust debate and discussion. This has been very, very helpful to me, and I think to the commission. And again, we will continue to stay in touch with you. And if you have any ideas, please make sure you pass them on to us. But we are grateful to everybody for your time, and again, for your insights. This has been a very good hearing. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.